Bibi and Tina, the Hungarian Horsemen. Sunset. A muffled rattling filled the train compartment. Outside, the scenic landscape rushed by. Rolling hills, cornfields, rivers, lakes and forests, and above it all, a golden summer sun burned brightly in a cloudless sky. Bibi Blocksberg, the little witch from Newtown, gazed dreamily out the window. In the distance, she could make out the first foothills of a mountain range. Somewhere far, far beyond, she thought, lies Hungary. The passing view made her tired, and no sooner had Bibi closed her eyes when she suddenly felt someone shaking her. "Hey, Bibi, no sleeping!" She glanced up to find her friend, Tina, standing beside her with a reminder about their mission to find the dining car. Dining car? Oh, yes, dinner! Only now did Bibi realize how hungry she was. "I'm on my way," she shouted, and followed her friend out into the corridor. Bibi was in high spirits. Vacations in Hungary were simply the greatest. She and Tina had eagerly accepted an invitation from Count Falco von Falkenstein to accompany the wild horse Stormy to Szendrö's stud farm. The stallion belonged to a friend of the Count and was used at the farm for breeding. As long as the journey was to Hungary, for Bibi it was like being on vacation. Anticipation was the greatest joy, and, as always, she loved every minute of the train ride. Tina, on the other hand, was feeling quite gloomy. This particular trip had one major drawback. Tina's boyfriend, Alexander von Falkenstein, was not allowed to come along. After getting poor grades at school, his father had insisted that he study with a private tutor during the break. At first, Alex had protested vehemently, but the Count had remained stubborn, and in the end had even threatened to send his son to boarding school. So now the two friends were traveling to Hungary without Alex, a circumstance that seemed to dampen Tina's mood the entire way. Bibi had firmly set her mind on cheering up her friend. Tina certainly missed the young von Falkenstein, but there would be plenty of things at Szendrö Stud to distract her, not least the wild horse Masha, which Tina already knew from her last visit. "Come, Tina," said Bibi, taking Tina's arm in a show of support. "We'll soon have our favorite Hungarian meal. Yes. A nice fozolek. Our favorite Hungarian vegetable stew," Tina enthused. A cozy table for two was still available towards the end of the dining car. A friendly waiter came over to greet them. "Jos det kívánok. Good evening, ladies. May I show you to your seats?" Bibi and Tina smiled at the formal address and enjoyed being escorted through the dining area. The waiter even moved the chairs out for them. Since they already knew what they wanted to eat, the friends sat down and immediately placed their order. Shortly afterwards, the waiter appeared again and served them 2 plates of steaming stew. With a "Jó étvágyat," he wished them a good appetite, bowed, and then moved over to 4 guests at a neighboring table who wanted to pay. The soft murmur of voices was unexpectedly drowned out by a booming yell. "Gee, Steve, what the heck? Every table's full in here!" Bibi turned around. 3 men had entered the dining car. "Just take it easy, Carl," said the one who'd been addressed as Steve. "I'll sort it out." He was a broad-shouldered guy in his mid-20s like the other two, with a gold chain flashing around his thick neck. The wispy blonde hair on his round head was beginning to thin out. His 2 companions looked rather scrawny next to him. The one Steve had called Carl was tall and thin, wearing his garishly patterned shirt unbuttoned too low. The other one, a small, wiry guy with narrow, piercing eyes, wore a baggy jogging suit. "You know," the third guy snorted, "Steve always manages everything." "You're right, Johnny," shouted Carl, and the 3 of them moved towards the table next to Bibi and Tina. Steve had seen that the 4 guests had just paid their bill. "Come on, hurry up," he snarled at them. "You can talk somewhere else." Tina rolled her eyes. "Those 3 really are lovely gentlemen," she whispered to Bibi. The 4 guests had already stood up to leave. They looked at Steve, Carl, and Johnny with annoyance, but said nothing more and left the dining car. The men fluttered into the free chairs, and Steve snapped his fingers impatiently at the waiter. The best thing is not to pay any attention to them, said Bibi. But that was not so easy. After the waiter had taken their order with a visibly irritated expression on his face, the three men continued talking so loudly that Bibi and Tina couldn't hear anything else. They raved on about their last trip to Canada. Bibi nearly choked on her food. The three were boasting that they had hunted wild bears. They even called this an adventure trip. If Bibi had understood correctly, they would fire up a jeep, set traps, and hunt innocent animals. But wild horses are a completely different game, Steve warned. They're supposed to be damn fast. You have to figure out how to get behind them. Pah, snorted Johnny. I can't wait till I rope me one of those beasts. Bibi couldn't believe what she'd just heard. She immediately lost her appetite. She could see from the corner of her eye that Tina felt the same way. Bibi's friend glared angrily over at the next table, and Steve noticed. Is there a problem, Ginger? He said to Tina. Yes, there is, countered Tina. Bibi could hear her anger. Hunting wild horses is the worst thing in the world. At this, the three men burst out laughing. Bibi felt her anger rise. She wanted to turn them all into big, fat, knobbly toads. Unfortunately, she had to give Count Falco von Falkenstein her word of honor not to use magic on the journey. But the more the three laughed, the harder she found it to control herself. Hey, Blondie! Steve now shouted at her too. What are you looking at? Bibi secretly stuck her fingers under the tabletop. Then she whispered, Eeny, meeny, winding roads, these three men will turn to... Tina hastily interrupted her. Bibi, don't. Remember what you promised. Bibi stopped the spell just in time, and Tina quickly waved the waiter over. The two friends paid. When they left the dining car, Bibi couldn't help herself and turned once more to the three men with a sinister expression on her face. Have a nice evening, Blondie, Steve shouted after her, grinning. Bibi shoved the compartment door behind her with a loud thwack. The two friends were still troubled by the dining car incident when, about a half an hour later, the train made a long stop in a mountain village to restock supplies. Bibi and Tina had agreed with the train conductor before their departure that they would look after the wild horses during the trip. Tina took some treats and went out onto the platform with Bibi, where the conductor was already waiting for them. He led them to the cargo wagon at the end of the train and opened the door for the girls. Here you are, ladies, he said. Like the waiter in the dining car, he took a small polite bow. Köszönöm, replied Bibi, who remembered the Hungarian word for thank you. As she climbed into the carriage with Tina, the two were greeted by a joyful neigh. Stormy snorted and huffed. Bibi patted the stallion on the neck, and Tina gave him the treats. Yes, my brave Stormy, Bibi whispered to him. Everything was going just fine for the horse. He didn't even seem a bit nervous. Bibi and Tina knew that Stormy had been transported by train before, and he clearly wasn't bothered by such a long journey. The train conductor motioned to the friends that the trip was about to continue, and that it was time to return to their car. Bibi and Tina hugged Stormy goodbye and wished him good night. Tina took a deep breath of clear, fresh mountain air as she walked back along the train with Bibi. Somehow everything feels wrong on this vacation, she sighed. First Alex isn't allowed to come, and then we meet these three buffoons in the dining car. A church tower bell rang out 9 o'clock, its sound echoing throughout the range. Bibi's gaze wandered over the mountainside to where the sun was setting, bathing the peaks in a luminous red. It looked as if they were glowing. Look how beautiful it is, Bibi tried to cheer up her friend. She remembered an old saying, and immediately her heart felt lighter again. Don't you know what that red glow means? Red skies at night, horse riders' delight. That's a good sign. Bibi finally managed to make Tina smile. You'll see, said Bibi confidently. Even without Alex, our stay at Szendrö Stud will still be great. Big disappointment. While the train wound through the mountains at night without any further stops, Bibi and Tina slept peacefully in their cabin, dreaming of their horses, the wild puszta, and beautiful days at Szendrö Stud Farm. Bibi was awoken the next morning by a tickle in her nose. Through a slight opening in the curtain, a ray of sunshine fell straight across Bibi's face. With an "Ugh!" she bolted up, wide awake. She jumped out of bed and drew the curtains. Outside, A huge lake glistened in the morning sun. Its banks stretched endlessly to the horizon, and sailboats drifted through the gentle waves. Bibi knew this place. It was Lake Balaton, the biggest lake in all of Hungary. It would be some time before they reached Csikós. Nevertheless, Bibi was already quite excited. "Wake up, Tina," she called and shook her friend. "We're in Hungary." Tina yawned and stretched. When she looked out the window, her face lit up. The two friends went to freshen up. When they returned to their cabin, the train conductor met them in the corridor pushing a snack car. He wished them good morning with a cheerful, "Jo regel." "What will it be, ladies?" he asked. "A light breakfast?" That was exactly what Bibi and Tina had in mind. As the girls finished their tea and croissants, the vast plains of the Puszta spread out before them. The train made several stops in smaller towns, until finally their stop was announced over the loudspeakers. "Csikós!" Bibi and Tina collected their luggage and left the cabin. Through the windows in the corridor, they watched a few passing farms and the first houses of Csikós before slowly approaching the station. Bibi's heart beat faster. Only a few people were waiting in front of the small station house. Bibi looked for Mikosch, but could not find his black curly hair anywhere. Wouldn't he have come by carriage to pick up Bibi and Tina, as he usually did? "He's probably just late," said Tina, who had noticed Bibi's disappointed face. "Let's get Stormy out of cargo first." Tina's right, thought Bibi. For sure, Mikosch was just late and would go straight to the station building with the carriage. Apart from the two girls, only a few travelers had gotten out. Bibi and Tina saw that the train conductor was at the far end and had already extended the ramp of the transport car. While they were still walking alongside the train, a wagon door suddenly opened beside them. A suitcase flew onto the platform in a high arc, nearly missing both Bibi and Tina. Two more bags hit the ground with a thud, as three sleepy figures shuffled hurriedly out of the car. "Man, you guys! I told you we shouldn't have been sleeping so late!" At once, Bibi's hands formed into fists as last night's rage returned. The men who stumbled out of the wagon were none other than the three guys from the dining car. Steve cursed and scolded as he picked up his bag from the ground. He didn't seem to have had time to comb his hair, because his thin blonde strands were sticking straight up on end. All three men were wearing the same clothes as the previous evening. Judging by the wrinkles and folds, it was clear that they had slept in them. "Can you turn it down, Steve?" Carl moaned. "I've got a nasty headache." That really sent Steve into a fury, but Bibi didn't hear much of his ranting because Tina had quickly pulled her away. "What a stupid coincidence," she hissed. "They had to get off here in Csikós, of all places." "Do you think they'll stay around here?" Bibi asked, horrified. Tina shook her head. "They'll probably rent a car and drive on into the Puszta, where it's really lonely, and where they can hunt wild horses undisturbed," Bibi added grimly. Stormy lowered his head calmly when Bibi and Tina entered the carriage. The stallion whinnied and snorted happily, letting himself be let out easily onto the platform. The train conductor climbed up the ramp once more and brought out Stormy's saddle to the girls. "I wish you a wonderful stay here in Csikós," he said. Bibi and Tina thanked him and ran over to the station building. The platform was now deserted. There was nothing more to see of Steve, Carl, and Johnny, but nothing of Mikosch either. This stung Bibi a little. "Has Mikosch forgotten us?" she wondered. "That's strange," said Tina, beginning to feel Bibi's concern. "If Mikosch had other plans, then I'm sure Janosch would be here to pick us up." Minute by minute, the hand of the station clock jumped forward with a loud clack. Almost half an hour had passed since they arrived in Csikós. "I guess we'll have no choice but to walk," Tina said. It was quite a long way to Szendrö stud farm. The sun was high in the sky, and it was scorching hot. They'd certainly work up quite a sweat on their way. But neither the long walk nor the heat were as bad for Bibi as the thought of having been stood up by Mikosch. "Come on, Bibi, don't be downhearted," Tina comforted her friend. "It'll all make sense once we get there." Bibi nodded slightly and strapped her bag to the saddle. When Tina had also fastened hers, they set off with Stormy. The girls walked around the station house and stepped out into the street. It must not have rained for weeks, as Stormy's hooves stirred up the dust on the cobblestones. The station was on the edge of Csikós, and the three of them soon reached the main road. It was very quiet in the midday heat. Not a single bird could be heard from the avenue trees lining the road. Only the clatter of Stormy's hooves and somewhere, far away, a dog barking. Bibi and Tina both turned in shock as the sound of an engine came roaring up behind them, shattering the silence as it shot towards the girls and the wild horse. A car was approaching from Csikós, driving way too fast. The windows were rolled down, and music blared from inside what they could now see was a bright green Jeep. Stormy whinnied and danced nervously on the spot. Bibi held the rope with both hands while Tina tried to calm the wild horse. Together, they led Stormy to a shady spot under one of the avenue trees. The Jeep easily had enough road to steer wide around them, but instead the driver cut it close and floored the gas pedal, vrooming past Bibi, Tina, and the wild horse. Everything went incredibly fast. For a fleeting moment, Bibi and Tina caught a glimpse of who was sitting inside the car. Nobody else but Steve, Carl, and Johnny. The three men laughed and roared gloatingly as they shot past the girls and the wild horse. Stormy panicked and reared upwards. Bibi couldn't hold him anymore. The rope was torn from her hands and she fell backwards into the grass. "Whoa! Easy, easy!" cried Tina. She kept a safe distance from the stallion's front hooves before finally getting hold of the halter. Bibi grabbed the lead. "Everything's all right," whispered Tina into the ear of the trembling Stormy, while Bibi patted his neck. Only when the Jeep was far away, when both the music and engine noise had faded into silence, did the stallion again regain composure. "These guys are dangerous," Tina wailed. Bibi considered that maybe she'd been wrong all along to think they'd have a lovely vacation in Hungary. To the contrary, Tina was sad because Alex had not been allowed to come. She, Bibi, was disappointed because Mikosch had not picked them up from the station. And now this encounter with Steve, Carl, and Johnny. If it went on like this, the trip would be a disaster. A bad sign. Bibi and Tina continued their route with Stormy through the scorching midday heat. The avenue trees, which had previously provided them with shade, lined the road only until the next crossing. From that point on, there was nothing above the girls but the deep blue sky and a piercing summer sun. Again and again, Bibi wondered why Mikosch had not picked them up at the station. She was less disappointed than upset by it, and the longer they had to go, the more angry she got that Mikosch had let them walk all the way. No sooner had the girls begun to worry about missing the turnoff to Szendrö Stud, when Bibi spotted a signpost through the flickering hot air. It pointed left in the direction of a narrow dirt road. They came closer to read the lettering. "Szendrö, at last!" When the dirt road made a bend, they saw the stud farm up ahead. The thatched white houses glowed brightly in the glaring sunlight. Bibi looked out for Mikosch, but could see neither him nor Janosch. Not a soul was to be found in the whole yard. The two girls called out for Mikosch and Janosch, but neither came to greet them. The only answer Bibi and Tina received was a joyous barking coming from behind the stud farm. A big dog came bounding around the corner of the house, wagging his tail. With his brown fur and salt and pepper markings, he almost looked like a wolf. He had a white spot on his neck, to which he owed his name, Snowball. This mongrel not only looked similar to a wolf, but he had also been raised by them. After Mikosch, Alex, Bibi, and Tina had found and rescued him one day, they all decided he should live at Szendrö Stud. He had recognized the girls' voices immediately, and now he jumped up playfully back and forth between them. "Hey, take it easy, Snowball," laughed Tina. "Yes, we missed you too," cried Bibi. She crouched down and the dog licked her face to greet her. The reunion with Snowball did them good. During the first few moments of their arrival, the girls had felt like strangers on the deserted stud farm. Now they felt comforted by the unexpected welcome. But the stud farm was not quite as deserted as Bibi and Tina had thought. While the two of them frolicked around with Snowball, they did not notice that someone else was coming around the corner of the house. It was a man of Janosch's age, with a thick gray mustache. He stopped in the shadow of the thatched roof and watched the girls smiling for a while before addressing them. Well, well, well. Who do we have here? Bibi and Tina looked up in surprise. They'd never seen this man before at the stud farm. He winked at them with his friendly brown eye, and the girls found him quite personable. When they introduced themselves, the man raised his thick, bushy eyebrows in amazement. You arrived today already? Janosch didn't expect you until next week. He is still at another stud farm and won't return until tonight. Oh, excuse me. He removed his wide-brimmed hat and introduced himself to the two girls. May I? Andreas is my name. I've been lending a hand here at the stud farm for some time now, and my help is needed more than ever since... He interrupted himself. Bibi listened intently. What did Andreas want to say? Yes, since what? She asked. But Andreas shook his head. Nothing, he muttered, and then called out. But first of all, Üdvözöljük. Welcome, you two. Bibi shot a glance at her friend Tina. She, too, seemed surprised that Andreas hadn't finished his sentence. The old man quickly busied himself by helping unstrap the luggage from the saddle and then loosening Stormy's girth. We'll tend to the horse first, and then I'll take you to the guest room. You must be starving after your long journey. Bibi and Tina left their travel bags on the veranda in front of the house and followed Andreas, who led Stormy to the stable. It appeared as though the roof there was being repaired. A ladder was leaning against the wall next to a pile of straw. Andreas made a wide detour around it, which Bibi and Tina found a bit strange. They took the shortest way to the stable entrance and were just about to go under the ladder when Andreas flinched violently. Waving his arms and showering the girls with a flood of Hungarian sentences neither of them could understand. Only when he said loudly, "Stop! Stop! Back!" they understood what he wanted to tell them. Andreas took a deep breath as the girls moved slowly away from the ladder. What was that all about? Bibi asked, bewildered. What's so dangerous about the ladder? Andreas was so excited that he broke out in a cold sweat. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief before he could answer. Don't you know what great misfortune that brings? He grumbled and rolled his eyes theatrically. Bad luck? When you go under a ladder? Bibi could only shake her head at that, but Tina had heard about it before. It's superstition, she whispered to Bibi as they followed Andreas into the stable. Oh, you mean something like, a four-leaf clover brings good luck? Bibi asked quietly, but not quietly enough. Andreas had heard their conversation. It's not superstition, he shouted with a raised forefinger. You must never go under a ladder, do you hear? Andreas began to lecture Bibi and Tina about what events lead to great misfortune. Black cats crossing your path from right to left. Owls calling on the roof of a house, or a broken mirror, which meant 7 years of bad luck. But the worst thing is, Andreas muffled his voice as if to ward off misfortune and announced, the Delibob. Delibob? Bibi asked. What is it? Oh, a bad sign. Andreas explained to the girls that a Delibob is a mirage that one could see out over the puszta on hot summer days. It was something like an optical illusion in the desert, or when faraway places suddenly appeared and seemed to be within reach. A Delibob confuses the senses, Andreas exclaimed. Believe me, it brings bad luck. Only a few days ago, Andreas had seen one of these mirages over the puszta. Dismayed, he had run to Janosch, who'd never been interested in premonitions or bad signs in the first place. Janosch had laughed, but Andreas interrupted his story for a moment. He had reached a free stall and led Stormy inside. Here, my dearest, he whispered to the wild horse. Eat your fill first. He shoveled hay and oats into a manger and then closed the stall door. But, asked Bibi, who eagerly wanted to know what misfortune this Delibob was supposed to have brought. She wasn't only asking out of curiosity. It had not escaped her attention that Andreas had told her about Janosch, but he didn't once mention another name, Mikosch. But then came misfortune, Andreas continued with wide gestures. Dissension and strife befell Szendrö stud. Janosch no longer laughed when Mikosch suddenly... Bibi was bursting with anticipation. Tina's wide eyes were fixed on Andreas. but he was frozen, afraid to utter his own words. He looked from one girl to another, lowered his arms, and muttered hastily, "I didn't say anything." "Please, Andreas," begged Bibi. "What about Mikosch?" "I haven't said anything," Andreas repeated. "Yes, you have," Tina urged. "You said that misfortune has befallen Szendrö stud farm." Andreas was suddenly in a great hurry to leave the stable. "Misfortune? Yes, there's a lot of misfortune in the world," he offered, avoiding the questions of two inquisitive friends. The girl stayed close behind him as he ran out into the yard. Bibi was determined not to let up. "You just told us," she said emphatically, "that Janosch hadn't laughed anymore when something happened with Mikosch. What was that about?" But Andreas just shook his head, and again his only answer to Bibi was, "I didn't say anything." Bibi and Tina understood that there was nothing more to be gained from Andreas. For whatever reason, he remained silent. He helped them take their luggage to the guest room, and then went with them to the kitchen. There was a pot of vegetable soup on the stove, which he warmed up for them, and from the refrigerator he took a jug of homemade lemonade. He apologized that he still had urgent work to do, and left the two girls alone. After Bibi and Tina had had lunch, they went to look for the horses Tango and Masha. They found them in the second stable building behind the grain silo. The two wild horses were obviously happy to see the girls again, which was a comfort the friends needed after their strange reception at the stud. They were eager to talk to Janosch. Andreas had said that he wouldn't be back until the evening, so the girls spent the afternoon riding around the farm. Tango and Masha hadn't been ridden in a long time, and were whinnying happily as they galloped through the high grass of the puszta with Bibi and Tina on their backs. In the evening, Janosch finally returned to the stud farm on his tractor. But if Bibi and Tina had hoped to learn more about Mikosch now, they were in for big disappointment. Janosch looked worn out and exhausted as the two girls ran toward him in the yard. Having met Andreas on the way in, he already knew that Bibi and Tina had arrived. Janosch was visibly sorry, almost contrite about the fact that he had mistaken the girls' arrival time and had not picked them up at the station. Apart from that, however, he was not very talkative. Bibi and Tina did not dare to ask him about Mikosch at first. Only when the three of them had eaten dinner on the veranda did Bibi work up her courage. "Janosch?" she began. The sun had just sunk below the horizon, and Janosch seemed to be far away with his thoughts. "Andreas told us about a great misfortune," Bibi continued cautiously. Janosch frowned. "A misfortune?" "Yes, he said something about quarrels and discord," Tina helped her friend. Janosch seemed to gradually understand what the two girls were getting at. His face darkened, and he crossed his arms in front of his chest. "I don't want to talk about that rascal," he muttered. "Rascal?" Bibi repeated in amazement. What had happened? Janosch had always been a fatherly friend to Mikosch, standing by the orphaned boy in all his troubles. "Please, Janosch," Tina made a second attempt. "We're worried about Mikosch." Janosch took a long while to consider his answer, grumpily gnawing on a toothpick that he shuffled from side to side. "This rascal," he finally spoke, "has left Szendrö stud farm." "What?" shouted Bibi, stunned. "It can't be!" She saw that Janosch had tears in his eyes. Nevertheless, his voice sounded hard and cold when he said, "Mikosch is gone, and it's better that way." Riddle about Mikosch. That night, Tina had tossed and turned restlessly. She had had a bad dream and woke up late the next morning. It took Tina a little while to realize where she was, and noticed that Bibi was no longer in her bed. Her clothes were gone from the chair where she had neatly folded them in the evening, and since Bibi's helmet had also disappeared, she must have gone riding. Tina decided to get up and look for her friend. She also had a hunch where she might be. After she got up and washed herself, Tina slipped into her riding clothes, took her helmet, and went out of the house. In the stable, Masha welcomed her with a loud neigh. After she had cleaned, saddled, and bridled the mare, Tina jumped up and rode out into the puszta. The place where Tina expected to find her friend was a good distance from Szendrö stud. It was Mikosch's summer cottage, where Bibi and Mikosch had spent a lot of time together. She found Bibi in Mikosch's hammock, which Bibi had stretched between the hut and a mighty old chestnut tree. She looked tired and sad. Tina sat down in the hammock next to Bibi and put one arm around her friend. For a while, neither of them spoke a word. "I couldn't sleep anymore," Bibi finally broke the silence. "And I didn't want to wake you, so I went off on my own." "You're worried about how Mikosch is doing, aren't you?" Tina asked. "Yes," replied Bibi, "but I'm a bit angry too. Mikosch can't just run away like that. Has he forgotten all about me?" "Mikosch certainly hasn't forgotten you," Tina reassured her friend. But why had he simply disappeared like that? And what had Mikosch and Janosch argued about so intensely? "I absolutely must speak with Mikosch," Bibi said decidedly. "Janosch and Andreas have to know where he is. I'll pressure them until they tell me." With that, Bibi jumped up. Tango and Masha raised their heads and trotted over from the draw well. The two girls swung into their saddles and galloped back to the stud farm. Bibi and Tina could see from afar that the tractor wasn't in the yard. Janosch seemed to be on the road again, but Andreas had seen them arrive at the back of the stable, where he was repairing the paddock fence. Snowball ran towards them, barking happily as they came around the house. The girlfriends unhitched their horses, which were still quite hot and sweaty from the gallop, rubbed their hair with straw, and tied them in the shade under the stable roof to let them cool off. Behind the barn, Bibi confronted Andreas without hesitation. He seemed to be afraid that the girls might ask him about Mikosch again, and at first he tried to talk his way out of it. He had said something about quarreling? Oh yes, the Delibab, the mirage, the evil sign? Yes, there had been a disagreement between Mikosch and Janosch, but he knew nothing more about it. Bibi did not give up, and soon Tina also spoke up. "Mikosch rode out into the puszta all alone?" she wanted to know. But no, he followed the Csikós," Andreas babbled away. When he realized what had just slipped out of his mouth, he cringed and stammered. I didn't say anything. I said nothing." But now it was certainly too late for excuses. "Who are these Csikós?" Bibi asked. "And why did Mikosch follow them?" Sighing, Andreas sat down on the fence and began to tell the story from the beginning. The beginning was, and remained for Andreas, that darned Delibab. He had seen it in the morning, but at first nothing more happened than that Janosch received a call from Count Falco von Falkenstein around noon. The Count and Janosch talked about the wild horse, Stormy, and other matters concerning Szendrö stud farm. When they also talked about Mikosch, the Count remarked that it was high time to send the boy to a proper school. After all, he would need a diploma if he was to become anything at all. The two finally agreed that it would be best for Mikosch if he went to a boarding school, which the Count also wanted to support financially. Because the boy only ever had horses on his mind, the boarding school should be as far away from the stud farm as possible, in the Hungarian capital, Budapest. There, Mikosch would have minimal distractions. Bibi could not imagine this at all. Mikosch? In a big city? That would never work out. "That's what Mikosch said when Janosch spoke to him about it," Andreas continued. But Janosch could not be dissuaded from this idea. He insisted that Mikosch should go to school right after the summer vacation. The boy had protested loudly against it. He would never part with his beloved horse, Baboshko. Janosch remained unyielding, and as a result, a fierce argument broke out between the two. "Then I'd rather ride with the Csikós," Mikosch had shouted before jumping on the back of his horse and riding off. That was the great misfortune that Delibab had delivered. Andreas gazed out at the puszta with a gloomy look. "But who are these Csikós?" Bibi urged. As far as she had understood, it was bad enough that Mikosch had left the stud farm just like that. But the real problem seemed to be these Csikós. They were the reason why Janosch did not want to talk about Mikosch anymore. "Who are the Csikós?" Andreas slowly repeated Bibi's question. His look darkened even more when he said, "Janosch thinks the Csikós are prowlers. Even worse, he says the Csikós are outlaws." Bibi and Tina couldn't believe what they heard. That was completely out of the question. Their Mikosch, who they knew for so long, went and joined a gang of criminals? The Hungarian Horsemen. Yes, and I'll say it again. They are criminals, thieves, idiots. Bibi and Tina were pacing back and forth. They had listened to Andreas's story so eagerly that they hadn't even noticed when Janosch drove his tractor into the yard by the other side of the stables. "The Csikós!" he cried. As he did so, his face flushed red with anger. "Stealing like ravens! They are losers!" "Janosch, you know that I have a different opinion," Andreas contradicted him. "There's something of the Csikós in every Hungarian." "Pah!" Janosch retorted scornfully. "You cannot deny," Andreas insisted, "that the Hungarians were once a great nation of horsemen. The Hungarians, or Magyars as they called themselves, were once a nation of nomads, proud horsemen who roamed the land on their steed. They came from the far east and traveled across vast regions until finally reaching the Carpathian flatland, which is now called the Great Hungarian Plain. Only here they settled down and founded the Hungarian kingdom. All this happened ages ago, but however many centuries have passed since then, through the eventful history of the Hungarian people, many traditions have still been preserved to this day. Deep inside us, Andreas said thoughtfully, we are still the wild riders of prehistoric times, and there is nothing more beautiful and inspiring for us than to hunt across the open puszta on horseback. The Csikós, Andreas continued, had upheld many of the traditions. They were horse herders who, like the old Magyars, wandered the country as nomads with their herds. They were considered the best riders of the puszta and admired for their arts. Some people, however, viewed the Csikós with disdain because of their unsteady life. Like Janosch, they called the horse herders drifters or accused them of theft. But to Andreas, this amounted to nothing more than prejudice. The Csikós also passed by the Szendrö stud farm once or twice a year. This time they had pitched their tents not far from Mikosch's summer cottage, and the boy had made friends with them. "If only I had forbidden him to do that," Janosch complained. "Make friends with Csikós! How can one be so foolish?" Bibi was pensive. Somehow she could understand Mikosch. He had always had a wild and free life at Szendrö stud, and now he was supposed to attend boarding school in a big city. Baboshko and all the other horses that he loved so dearly he would only be able to see on vacations. Sure, thought Bibi, school is important, but a boarding school like that would be a nightmare for Mikosch. Meanwhile, Tina had come up with a completely different idea. "Tell me, Janosch," she began carefully, "did you actually try to get Mikosch back?" Janosch was visibly uncomfortable with the question. I was angry," he mumbled. "Besides, I thought it was just typical nonsense for a boy of that age. I was convinced he would come back, and I still believe it now." Janosch had taken the greatest care to sound as if he truly believed his own words. The way that he now nervously twirled his mustache, however, showed that he wasn't quite so sure. For Bibi, it was a monstrous story. Mikosch and Janosch falling out, and Mikosch far, far away in the puszta with a group of horse herders. She absolutely had to talk to him. Maybe she could succeed in doing what Janosch hadn't even attempted to do in his anger, to persuade Mikosch to return to Szendrö. She asked Andreas and Janosch if they knew where the horse herders had gone. "Further northeast," Andreas replied. "There lies Hortobágy, a place to which the Csikós always return." Janosch examined Bibi urgently. He knew the little witch well enough to know that she had long since concocted a plan. "Why do you want to know that?" he asked. "Because I will ride after him," said Bibi resolutely. Janosch rolled his eyes. That was exactly the answer he had feared. "You want to ride alone through the puszta and find Mikosch?" "I'm not alone," Bibi countered. "Tina is with me." "And of course our horses, Tango and Masha," Tina added. Someone else joined in the conversation with loud barking. Snowball. He bounced excitedly from one to the other, jumping between Bibi and Tina before angling his head at Janosch with big, faithful doggy eyes. Janosch sighed. He knew that Bibi would never forget the idea. Together with Tina, she would do everything she could to find Mikosch. But why shouldn't the girls actually try? They were familiar with Tango and Masha. Snowball would certainly take good care of the two of them, And in an emergency, but only in an emergency, Bibi could also use magic. "Very well," said Janosch. "Ride to Hortobágy, but if you don't find Mikosch there, turn right around and come back. Do we understand each other?" The two girls rejoiced. Bibi certainly had not thought that Janosch could be persuaded so quickly. But Janosch was simply happy, and in his heart, relieved that the friends wanted to ride after Mikosch. During all those days with Mikosch already gone, his bad conscience tore at him, and he was worried about the boy. Bibi and Tina's departure for the puszta was decided. Andreas called his sister, Erzsébet, who lived in Hortobágy. She assured him that she would be happy to accommodate the two girls. She also promised to find out if a group of Csikós had arrived in the last few days. After lunch, Bibi, Tina, and Andreas put together some equipment for the trekking ride. With all the preparations, the afternoon went by in a flash. Dinner was cooked by Janosch, as usual, Hungarian stew, according to his special recipe. When everyone was completely full, Janosch spread out a map on the table. He showed Bibi and Tina the best way to ride to Hortobágy. "You do know how to use a compass, right? Because there might not be any reception out there at all." Of course, Bibi and Tina knew that. After all, they had often been on a trail ride, even in the puszta together with Mikosch. But it was good that Janosch explained the exact way to them. For most of their journey, they would ride through flat terrain. Any elevation on the horizon would help them with their orientation. But most importantly, they should always check the direction on the compass. Janosch pointed to some lines that were highlighted on the map, just north of Kerekes. The lines marked a chain of hills, at the foot of which was a small oak grove where the girls were to set up on their first night. "It's a good place to camp," Janosch assured them. "It's sheltered from the wind, and there's also a small spring with clear, fresh water." Janosch strongly recommended that they fill their water bottles there. Further north would lead them through swampy terrain, which was dry in midsummer and not too dangerous for horse and rider. Nevertheless, it was better for them to stay on the same paths where the Gulyás, the cowherders, drove their cattle. The next night they could pitch their tents at an old abandoned windmill, and on the third day, if they followed the compass and remained eastward, they would reach Hortobágy over the famous arched bridge around noon. Janosch folded the map, and Andreas gave Bibi and Tina a piece of paper on which he had written down his sister's address. It was almost 9 o'clock in the evening, and seeing as the girls wanted to leave at daybreak, they wished Janosch and Andreas a good night and went to their room.